Hi guys, welcome back. As you can see, we're still indoors because lockdown has actually just tightened up today. So instead of going out, I thought I'd actually go over a topic that's come up quite a bit when it comes to taking photos with a moving body of water, which is how fast should your shutter speed be? Like with a lot of things in photography, the answer is it depends. There is no right or wrong shutter speed. It generally depends on what sort of look you want to go for in your photos. Some will always prefer to have a fast shutter speed and freeze the movement of the water. Some are like myself and prefer to use a slower shutter speed and smooth it out a little bit, where you do lose some of the texture, but you get that nice silky look to it that you wouldn't get with a fast shutter speed. So instead of just talking about all the different shutter speeds that are available, I've actually got a couple examples with a full range of shutter speed from 1/1600th of a second. That's a tongue twister for you. All the way right up to 30 seconds. And at the end of it, you guys can decide which one you prefer, because there is no right and wrong. It literally comes down to what sort of look it is you want to go for and what it is you're trying to convey with the image as well. Before we get into the examples, I found there's actually 3 ways that you can categorize your shutter speed when you're taking pictures of moving water. And that's very fast shutter speed, which can always be done handheld because there's no chance of camera shake at the speed you're shooting at. And I'm talking speeds that if you use the reciprocal rule and you're at 24 millimeters, you're going at a speed that's anything faster than 1/25th of a second. Although if you're talking fast shutter speeds, you're more likely to go 1/200th of a second or faster. Then you've got medium shutter speeds, which are like 1/10th of a second up to 1 or 2 seconds. And then you've got long exposure shutter speeds, which are like 5 seconds and above. Naturally, you won't have shutter speeds in between that, so there is no definite shutter speed that you should choose. Try all the different ones that you can whilst you're out there taking photos, and then choose the image that you like best based on what you're getting. So what I'll do is I'll go from the fastest shutter speed to the longest shutter speed, and then you can see how different shutter speeds affect the images. And when you try them out yourself when you're out there taking photos, you can then decide which ones you like best as well. So to get started, well, let's look at this picture from Turmeda Beach, where I shot this one of a surfer who was getting ready to jump into the waves. And this one was shot at 1/1600th of a second. And if you zoom in, you can see that all of the water movement is completely frozen. The bubbles are frozen, the wave is frozen, even the splash of the waves is frozen as well. Oftentimes photographers will use the shutter speed like 1/1600th of a second or faster even if they can, because it captures the power of the water at that particular point in time. And it's what it would feel like if you're actually there on location as well, watching the waves crashing into the rocks, or hundreds of thousands of liters of water crashing over a waterfall every second, and you're freezing it at that point in time so you can see just how much water there is. Whereas if you were to do a long exposure on crashing waves, everything would be very smoothed out. That it wouldn't look as powerful, it would look much more serene and calm in comparison. This next image is one I took when I was at Shark Point a few months ago actually, because we've been in lockdown for 2 months now. And it wasn't as fast as the previous one, because this one I shot it at 1/200th of a second. But if you take a look at it when you zoom in, you can see that most of the water is frozen, but there is some movement in there as well, because this one was shot at 1/200th of a second. So whilst most of the water is frozen, because of the speed the water is moving at, not all of it is frozen. If you come down here to where the water is crashing off the rocks, you can see there is some movement in there, but it's not completely frozen. So it's sort of like an in-between. It's fast enough to freeze the action, but not slow enough to give you that silky smooth look as well. Photographers will often use fast shutter speeds such as that 1/1600th of a second or faster, or sometimes a little bit slower, to really freeze the motion, because they want to give you that sense of power and drama that that location has, whether it's the crashing waves or a waterfall. Because once you use that long exposure to smooth it out, whilst it will still be an amazing scene and still be an amazing photo, it doesn't have that same sense of drama that it would as if a fast shutter speed would, where you can freeze all the water and see just how much is going on there in comparison. You can use a fast shutter speed when you want to, and one of the great things about it is that you can do it handheld. You don't need a tripod because you don't need to worry about camera shake. A lot will still use a tripod because that way they can get their composition set and dialed in and their settings dialed in, and then it's just take as many pictures as you can, and hopefully you'll get that perfect picture that has all the waves crashing exactly the way you want it to. On top of fast shutter speeds, there's medium shutter speeds, and this is probably the largest range, because in this one you could potentially go handheld on it, but it would be safe to use a tripod with a shutter release as well, because you're no longer using that reciprocal rule where if you're at 24 millimeters you shoot at least 1/25th of a second. You will be like 1/10th or 1/3 or half a second, which with cameras nowadays and the amazing in-body stabilization that they have, you could potentially hold a camera for 1/10th or half a second and get a perfectly sharp image without camera shake because of that stabilization, if you've set it up properly. I would much rather prefer to just set my camera on the tripod and use the shutter release, because then I don't have to worry about camera shake or the 2-second timer and whatnot. It's just clickety clickety click. But it comes down to personal preference which one you want to go to. And this shutter speed has a full range. It could literally be from the limit of what hand holding a camera can do all the way up to maybe 2-3 seconds. After that, I consider that long exposure once you go over a couple seconds. But you still do get quite a variation in how the water will look between that, because even just the difference between something like 1/10 of a second and 4 seconds will change the way that the water looks quite a lot when you're taking the photo. I'll show you what I mean right here. This picture was taken at 1/10 of a second, and if you were to zoom in, you'll see that there's still some texture in the water, there's still some movement, but a lot of it has been smoothed out, because you've got that shutter open long enough and the water's moving fast enough that it all sorts of blends together a little bit. Alright, whereas if you look at this picture that's half a second in comparison and zoom in as well, you'll see that there's a lot less texture in the water. It's been smoothed out a little bit more, and that's because 1/10 of a second to half a second, in terms of water movement, there can be quite a big difference compared to half a second versus 0.4 of a second, which is almost the same. To give you another example of how something like 1/10 of a second versus half a second can make a difference, we'll take a look at this one, where this one's shot at 1/13 of a second, and you can still capture some of the waves crashing over the rocks, but you've also got all the water dripping off the rocks as well if you zoom in here. But if you look at this particular part of the photo, you'll see that as the water is actually coming off the rocks, it has been smoothed out a little bit. There is a little bit of frozen movement, but it has been smoothed out. Whereas for this one in comparison, which was shot at 0.8 of a second, and you zoom in, you can see there's a lot less texture in the water. It's a lot smoother, and that's because you've had that shutter open for a longer period of time, which allows the water to smooth out, and you do lose the texture, but you do get that silky smooth look to it instead. So as you can see, that with just a few subtle changes in the shutter speed, you can have some texture in the water, or you can have it a bit more smoothed out and have that silky look. Whichever one you prefer, it's generally up to you. I like both. In this particular instance, I prefer the one with that silky look, even though there's lots of waves crashing when you do freeze the motion, but I just prefer that serene look versus big pounding waves. But I'll show you one more picture, which is sort of medium, sort of long. It's a 4-second exposure that I did also at Turmada Beach. I know I've referenced it a lot, but it's the perfect example of how shutter speeds can affect the water movement in a photo. And in this one, I took this particular picture for 4 seconds because I was just curious to see how it would look. And as you can see on this one, a lot of the water has been smoothed out, that even the waves have been smoothed out a little bit, and the way that the waves have crashed this particular area here, it almost looks like there's a mist laying over the water instead of the water itself. And that's what would happen if you were to capture a longer exposure with fast moving water. Because of all the splashing, it just sort of blends in together to become one smooth layer over the top, where it doesn't give you the same sense of power and drama as if you froze the action, but it does create a very different look to it compared to the 1/1600th of a second picture where everything is completely frozen, or even the 1/200th of a picture where most of it's completely frozen, but there is some movement in there because the water is just moving that quickly. And last but not least, and that's long exposure photos. And long exposure could be anything from like 2 or 3 seconds and above, where you definitely need a tripod. And if you're not going to use like a time release on your shutter, I would highly recommend using a shutter release cable as well, because that way you minimize any chance of having any camera shake in your photo. And when it comes to long exposure, how long you're going to go for is literally up to you. There is no limit. The limit is how long can you keep your shutter open before your picture's completely blown out. I've got a couple examples here that go from 4 seconds all the way up to 3 minutes, so you can see how keeping your shutter open for that much longer can affect the water in your photo, because it could literally be the difference between having texture in the water or being completely smoothed out and flat to give you that very ethereal and silky look to it. And like I mentioned earlier, whichever one you prefer is generally up to you. You can always tweak your settings to get a faster or slower shutter speed depending on the look it is you want to go for. So these first two photos can show you the difference between 4 seconds and 30 seconds of exactly the same composition. I took this one near my old apartment where I used to live as the sun was setting. And because the sun was setting and I wanted to keep the ISO and the aperture at the same level, the only thing I could do was extend the shutter speed. So I had to extend it from 4 seconds to 30 seconds to get the same exposure in there. If you look at the first one, which is 4 seconds, you can see there is still some texture in the water because whilst 4 seconds is enough to smooth out most of it, it's not as smooth as the 30-second photo where there's been quite a bit of time that shutter speed's been open. Plus the bay was quiet enough that a lot of the water could have flattened out and you get that very silky smooth look to it. One of the benefits when there's not too many ferries going by, I should say. But that's the difference between 4 seconds and 30 seconds, where you still have some texture in the water at 4 seconds, but at 30 seconds there's almost none in comparison. And I generally like both. I prefer the color in the sky from the 4 seconds and the way the water looks versus the 30 seconds one. But I also like the smoothness of the 30-second photo. But what about longer than 30 seconds? Well, the next picture I've got is actually a 3-minute exposure. And I took it out at Kirribilli earlier this year when I was out taking photos there hoping for a sunset. And if you look at it, this is at Sydney Harbour, right, where there's lots of ferries going by, lots of boats, police boats, you name it, there's always something going on there because at the time I took this photo, we didn't have any restrictions on. But even at 3 minutes long on such a busy harbour, the water was smoothed out quite a bit because it had the shutter open for so long. I mean, it was able to get that very smooth glossy look, which you often won't get at Sydney Harbour just because of how busy their harbour is. And when I took this photo, I deliberately wanted to get something like 3 minutes in there, so I had to dial in the settings to get it. And I think it turned out quite nice because it's very hard to get that silky look to the water in Sydney Harbour considering how busy it is. But that's how changing your shutter speed can seriously affect how the water is going to look in your photos. Because you've got the really fast ones that I've shown at like 1/16th hundredth of a second. I'm still always going to get that wrong. 1/200th of a second, that's a lot easier to say. To 1/13th of a second, half a second, 4 seconds, or 3 minutes. What shutter speed generally depends on what sort of look it is you want to go for. There is no right and wrong. I often like that silky look to the water where you smooth it out as much as you can without it being overly smoothed out, so to speak, like that 4-second one from Turrametta Beach. Whereas I know other photographers who love to freeze the action and will always use something at like at least 1/2000th of a second and dial it in the rest of it, provided they've got that really fast shutter speed to freeze the motion. So I hope you guys did learn something today as to how the shutter speed does affect the way water will look in photos, especially when it's moving water like waves or waterfalls. If you do have any questions about any of the pictures I've taken or how you can set up your shutter speed to determine exactly what would be best, please let me know down in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you have liked this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. That will be greatly appreciated. And if you want to stay up to date with future videos as well, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tick that little bell. That way you'll always get a notification every time a new video comes out. But I'll leave it there for today. I hope you've enjoyed this one and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good night.